February 20, 1943. The chill of dawn still clung to the hills north of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia. German tank crews braced inside their Panzer IVs, engines rumbling low, exhaust fumes mixing with desert dust. Their orders were simple: hold the valley, blunt the Americans, and prove once again that German steel ruled the battlefield. Through the smoke and haze, movement appeared, Sherman tanks advancing, spread across broken ground. The Germans expected confusion, maybe even hesitation. After all, this was the Americans' first major clash with the seasoned Afrika Korps. But what unfolded defied their doctrine. 5 Shermans, hidden from one another by ridgelines and scrub, moved as if tethered by an invisible hand. Each tank adjusted to cover blind spots the others couldn't see. They converged at precisely the right moment, rolling into firing positions with a unity the Germans could not explain. No signal flags. No messengers on motorcycles. No flares arching into the sky. And yet, the Americans fought as one organism, fluid and seamless. Inside their Panzer, a German commander strained to hear his company leader's voice crackling through the FUG 5 radio. Static swallowed the words, every engine rev and electrical spark drowning out critical orders. His tank could receive, but not send. He was blind, deaf, and alone in the storm. The Shermans were not. Unseen but decisive, each American tank carried a marvel of technology, the SR 508 frequency modulation radio. It was crystal-controlled, transmitting with 25 watts of power, cutting through engine noise and battlefield chaos with clarity that seemed impossible. These radios turned every Sherman into more than just a tank. They turned them into a node of the world's first armored battlefield network. What the Germans never knew, until it was far too late, was that this invisible network would prove more powerful than thick armor or high-velocity guns. And that's the story we are going to uncover today. How a technological leap, born not in the factories of Krupp or the design bureaus of Berlin, but in the labs of Motorola and Chicago, reshaped armored warfare forever. How American engineers and soldiers combined steel and radio waves to outmaneuver an enemy whose machines were, on paper, superior. And how the lessons of those radios echo into the wars of our own century. If you're fascinated by these hidden dimensions of World War II, where battles were decided not just by tanks and planes, but by the invisible advantages of communication, then you're in the right place. Make sure you subscribe to this channel because here we bring you the untold stories of the Second World War. The ones buried in after-action reports, in dusty production records, in the memories of veterans who knew that survival depended on more than armor plate. Hit that like button if you want to see more deep dives like this and leave a comment below. Do you think radios were a bigger advantage than tank guns? I'd love to hear your take. Now let's step onto the battlefield, and into the ether of radio waves that changed the war. To understand why the Sherman's radios were such a shock to German troops, we need to begin years before the tanks rolled into Tunisia. In July of 1941, while the Wehrmacht was sweeping deep into the Soviet Union and armored divisions were racing across the steppe, a quieter revolution was underway in the United States. At Fort Knox, the U.S. Army Signal Corps signed off on a decision that seemed almost bureaucratic at the time, to standardize a new family of tank radios across all medium armored vehicles. These sets, designated SR 508, SR 528, and SR 538, would be manufactured by the Galvin Manufacturing Company of Chicago, a firm better known to the public under the name it would soon adopt, Motorola. For the engineers in those labs, the challenge was monumental. Radios and tanks were not a new idea. Germany had pioneered them as far back as the 1930s. But the problem was one of quality and clarity. The German FUG series used amplitude modulation, or AM, a technology prone to static, distortion, and interference. On a calm day in stationary conditions, AM worked well enough. But in the chaos of armored combat, with engines roaring, tracks grinding, sparks firing across electrical systems, German radios often became useless. Static drowned out commands. Words were swallowed mid-sentence. And most devastating of all, only a minority of German tanks even carried transmitters. Many had receivers only. A platoon leader could issue orders, but his subordinates could not report back. The Americans were determined to do better. Under the guidance of engineers Daniel E. Noble and Henryk Magnuski, Motorola pursued a technology that had long been overlooked: frequency modulation, or FM. FM had been developed by Edwin Howard Armstrong in the 1930s, and though it was known for its ability to suppress static and deliver crystal-clear signals, it was expensive and technically challenging to implement. Commercial broadcasters had little incentive to adopt it. But the U.S. Army saw the potential. The result was a system that transformed the Sherman tank into something more than a weapon. It became a node in a vast network. The SCR-508, the most famous of the sets, weighed 181 pounds in its full installation. Its BC-604 transmitter generated 25 watts of output, 2.5 times that of the German FUG-5. It operated between 20 and 27.9 MHz, with 10 preset crystal-controlled channels. For the first time, tankers could switch frequencies with the flip of a dial, without worrying about drift or recalibration. And it didn't stop there. The American sets came with dual receivers, allowing commanders to listen simultaneously to platoon chatter and company-level orders. The intercom system tied directly into the radio, so every crewman, from driver to loader, could pass urgent warnings directly into the headset of the commander. Voice was transmitted through rugged throat microphones that worked even when the man was shouting over the din of combat. It is hard to exaggerate how revolutionary this was in 1942. When a Sherman rolled off the assembly line in Detroit, it carried not only a 75mm gun and a gasoline engine but also a radio system that represented the pinnacle of electronic engineering. Every tank had one. Not just the command vehicles, not just the lead platoons. Every Sherman. This was no small achievement. Each SCR-508 contained nearly 3,000 individual components. Oscillators had to remain stable despite vibrations from shell fire. Power supplies had to filter out electrical noise from the tank's generator. Heat and dust could not be allowed to detune delicate circuits. Producing them required an industrial miracle. By 1944, Motorola factories in Chicago were churning out more than 24,000 sets a year. In total, over 50,000 would be delivered by the war's end, enough to equip every Sherman ever built. Now let's step back and consider the comparison. In 1943, Germany produced nearly 6,000 medium tanks. That same year, only about 2,000 full FUG-5 transceivers rolled out of their factories. The rest went into command vehicles or assault guns, leaving most tank crews to operate with little more than receivers. If the command tank was destroyed, and it usually was targeted first, the rest of the platoon fell into chaos. The Soviet Union fared even worse. In 1941, as their T-34s surged into battle, the vast majority lacked radios entirely. Crews relied on flag signals or pre-battle orders. Only a handful of command tanks carried functioning sets, and even those often malfunctioned. Soviet reports from that year are filled with grim notes about tanks missing objectives, advancing in the wrong direction, or failing to support one another at critical moments, all because they could not talk. In this context, American tankers had something no other army possessed: the assurance that, wherever they were never alone. Picture it, a Sherman platoon moving through a Norman hedgerow in June 1944. Each tank tucked behind hedges, visibility limited to a few dozen yards. German defenders crouched with Panzerfausts, waiting for a careless advance. But in the Shermans, commanders spoke to one another as if sitting side by side. Left flank covered. Watch for movement near the orchard. Artillery on call. Orders flowed seamlessly. Fire support arrived within minutes. To German troops watching, it seemed like sorcery. How could tanks hidden from each other move as if choreographed? How could they respond instantly to threats appearing beyond their own line of sight? The answer was not magic. It was FM radio. And here lies the irony. The very concept of radio-equipped tanks had been a German innovation. Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, had insisted in the 1930s that every panzer should carry a radio. He understood that speed and flexibility required constant communication. But by 1943, Germany's industry could no longer keep pace. Shortages of components, Allied bombing, and bureaucratic chaos meant that Guderian's own doctrine was betrayed by his own factories. The nation that had pioneered the idea now fielded tanks half-deaf and mute. The Americans, by contrast, embraced the principle wholeheartedly. Radios were not an afterthought, they were integral. And so, when Sherman tanks first met German Panzers in the deserts of Tunisia, the stage was set for a clash not only of steel and firepower, but of invisible waves that would shape the outcome in ways no one on the battlefield could yet fully understand. November 8, 1942. The largest amphibious operation in history at that time was underway. Operation Torch marked the debut of American armored forces against Germany's battle-hardened Afrika Korps. As Shermans rolled off landing craft onto the beaches of Morocco and Algeria, they brought with them not just guns and armor, but a technology the Germans did not expect: frequency modulation radios. For the Germans, North Africa was already a harsh proving ground. Sandstorms clogged engines. Dust reduced visibility to mere yards. Supply lines stretched across a continent. In this environment, communication was life or death. Yet Rommel's tanks, equipped mostly with FUG-5 radios, struggled with severe limitations. Static overwhelmed transmissions when vehicles moved. Orders had to be repeated again and again. And because only a minority of tanks could transmit, coordination broke down as soon as a command vehicle was knocked out. American units, by contrast, found themselves at an immediate advantage. Every Sherman that clattered onto the African shore carried a 25-watt FM transceiver, crystal-controlled for stability. In the confusion of amphibious landings, companies and platoons remained in constant contact. As German observers watched through binoculars, they saw enemy units maneuvering with precision despite dust clouds and broken terrain. To them it appeared almost unnatural. How could tanks that could not see one another act as if guided by a single mind? The answer, of course, was invisible. Radio waves pulsed through the air, binding each American crew together into a living network. The real test came in February 1943 at the infamous Battle of Kasserine Pass. Here, American forces met the full fury of the seasoned Afrika Korps. The clash was a tactical defeat for the inexperienced U.S. 1st Armored Division, but buried within the chaos lay a revelation that German intelligence could not ignore. Picture the scene: German Panzer IVs cresting a ridge, firing down on American positions. Dust clouds rising, artillery exploding, units scattered across miles of desert. In the German ranks, only a handful of tanks could call back to headquarters. Messages passed slowly, often misinterpreted. When a command tank was destroyed, the subordinate vehicles fought on blindly, uncertain of wider objectives. In the American ranks, something else was happening. Even as battalions were fragmented by the assault, Sherman stayed connected. Tankers who had never trained together coordinated movements in real time. A platoon cut off on one flank could still call for artillery support from a distant unit miles away. A commander under fire could warn his comrades of an approaching counterattack. The desert might have been vast, but American radio networks shrank it to a battlefield of instant awareness. German signals intelligence units intercepted these transmissions. What they heard shocked them. Clear, strong voices carried across miles of open desert, unaffected by static. Reports flowed in both directions, not just from commanders but from every tank. Analysts scribbled notes, trying to reconcile what they heard with their understanding of tank doctrine. One after-action German report concluded that American coordination was the result of unusually rigorous training and discipline. They assumed no technology could be this advanced; it had to be human organization. In reality, they were listening to the future of armored warfare. The impact was felt not just tactically but psychologically. For German crews used to strict hierarchy, the idea that every enemy tank could function as a command vehicle was disorienting. Their strategy of targeting command tanks, easily identified by extra antennas, was suddenly irrelevant. Knock out one Sherman and another would seamlessly take over. There was no head to cut off the snake. The geography of North Africa only magnified the advantage. Long sight lines across open desert made coordination vital, but dust clouds from hundreds of tracks often obscured vision. German units often relied on colored signal flares or prearranged maneuvers, both of which failed in the chaos of real battle. American units, meanwhile, used radio to adjust on the fly. Shift left. Cover the ridge. Hold fire, artillery inbound. Orders that took Germans minutes to signal could be transmitted instantly by U.S. crews. By the end of Kasserine, American forces had learned hard lessons about tactics, but they had also revealed to the enemy a glimpse of something terrifying: an armored force that moved with cohesion regardless of visual contact, regardless of confusion. The battle, often remembered as a setback, in truth demonstrated the resilience of the American communication network. Even in retreat, units did not collapse into total disorder, because their radios allowed them to maintain some semblance of control. German commanders left North Africa with mixed impressions. On one hand, they still believed American tankers were green and poorly trained compared to their own veterans. On the other, they could not shake the memory of Sherman's maneuvering in sync despite terrain that should have cut them off from one another. It was a warning they never fully understood. When the Axis finally surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943, it marked the end of the Afrika Korps as a fighting force. But for the Americans, it marked the beginning of something else. Confidence in a doctrine that treated radios not as accessories, but as weapons in their own right. Every Sherman carried not just firepower but communication power. And as U.S. forces prepared to move north into Italy, they carried with them this invisible advantage, one that would only grow more devastating in the hills and mountains of Europe. The Germans had witnessed the first hints of this power in the desert. They attributed it to luck or discipline, or perhaps even exaggerated reports from frightened crews. What they did not yet realize was that they were facing not simply tanks, but the world's first battlefield network. And networks, as history would soon prove, were far deadlier than individual machines. September 1943. The war shifted to the rugged terrain of Italy. Where deserts had tested engines with sand, the mountains of the Apennines would test communication systems in ways that armored warfare had never encountered before. Valleys, ridgelines, and thick stone villages fractured sight lines, forcing units to operate blind to one another. For the Germans, already struggling with radio limitations, this terrain was disastrous. For the Americans, with their FM radios, it was an arena where their technological edge became even sharper. When Allied forces landed at Salerno and later pushed toward Monte Cassino, every German officer expected radios to fail. Amplitude modulation, the basis of their FUG-5 sets, struggled terribly in complex environments. Signals bounced off rock faces, echoing and distorting until they dissolved into static. For many German tankers, it became routine. As soon as a valley wall rose on either side, their communications collapsed. Orders had to be relayed by messengers or worse by firing colored flares into the air, hoping someone on the other side of a ridge could see them through smoke and chaos. Meanwhile, Sherman tanks equipped with the SER 508 networked seamlessly. Frequency modulation handled multipath interference far better than AM. Instead of collapsing into noise, FM signals cut through the echoes. American platoons separated by mountainsides still coordinated like they were maneuvering across open desert. To German observers, this seemed impossible. How could units on opposite sides of a ridge attack simultaneously, hitting both flanks at once? To them it looked like clairvoyance. In reality, it was crystal clear radio coordination. Consider Monte Cassino, early 1944. The Allies faced a fortress of German positions dug into hillsides, supported by armor hidden among ruins and olive groves. Infantry assaults repeatedly faltered, and tanks were forced to crawl forward under constant threat of ambush. For the Germans, this was perfect defensive terrain. But the Sherman's radios shifted the balance. When one platoon encountered anti-tank guns, it instantly warned others to adjust routes. When infantry needed fire support, they called directly to nearby Shermans, who relayed updates through their network until artillery fire fell exactly where it was needed. German defenders were bewildered. Their own tanks could hear orders from command, but most could not reply. A platoon leader destroyed meant silence for the rest of his unit. American units, by contrast, adapted on the fly. One Sherman commander could be killed, and another tank would immediately take over coordination. This adaptability broke the rigid German doctrine that relied on unbroken chains of command. In after-action reports, U.S. officers often described this capability as routine. "We maintained coordination across terrain where visibility was zero," one report noted casually. To the Germans, however, it defied everything they believed possible. They had built their doctrine around the assumption that tanks required line of sight for effective cooperation. Now they faced an enemy who had shattered that rule. The SER 508 not only excelled technically but also changed the psychology of combat. American crews knew that no matter how isolated they appeared, they were never truly alone. Even if cut off by terrain or enemy fire, their voices carried across the ether to comrades nearby. German crews, in contrast, often fought in lonely silence. The crackle of static on their radios reminded them of their isolation. Tank after tank would be destroyed simply because its crew could not warn others of hidden threats. The Italians themselves became silent witnesses to this technological duel. Villagers watching from hillsides saw American tanks pivot and cover one another with uncanny timing. German tanks, no less powerful in armor or armament, seemed sluggish in comparison, reacting slowly and often too late. By mid-1944, this contrast was undeniable. As U.S. forces prepared for the Great Assault in northern France, they carried with them lessons learned in both desert and mountains. Radios weren't just tools, they were weapons. German intelligence, however, still misinterpreted what they had seen. Reports to Berlin claimed that American success came from tight discipline and mechanical adherence to procedures. They never realized that the procedures were possible only because of FM technology. Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. As the Shermans rolled off landing craft and into the chaos of Normandy, their radios again proved decisive. Unlike in North Africa, these tanks now fought in bocage country, narrow hedgerows, winding lanes, and farm fields bounded by earthen walls. Visibility collapsed to a few dozen yards. German infantry with Panzerfausts could lurk behind every hedge. For armored warfare, it was one of the most lethal environments imaginable. At first, even the Americans struggled. Their radios, tuned for tank-to-tank coordination, could not speak directly with infantry radios, which operated on different frequency ranges. This created deadly gaps. Tankers had no warning when enemy infantry stalked them through hedgerows, and infantry had no way to call for fire support from tanks just yards away. German soldiers exploited this, ambushing Shermans at close range. The solution came swiftly. American ingenuity, spurred by necessity, produced one of the simplest yet most revolutionary adaptations of the war, the tank telephone. By wiring a rugged E8 field telephone to the outside of the Sherman and linking it into the intercom, infantry could now speak directly to tank crews. A soldier could run up, pick up the handset and shout, "Enemy ahead!" and the Sherman's gun would respond instantly. Within weeks, nearly every U.S. armored unit had adopted the modification. By the time of Operation Cobra in late July, the system had transformed tank-infantry cooperation. Here, the synergy of radios and field telephones turned American armored forces into something the Germans could not match. Hundreds of tanks surged across hedgerows, guided not by rigid pre-planned signals but by living communication networks that stretched from infantry squads all the way to artillery observers. German defenders, expecting lumbering armored thrusts, instead faced a fluid storm of coordination. And as always, the Germans tried to make sense of it. Captured reports describe American tanks as responding to threats with supernatural speed. They could not grasp that every Sherman was not an isolated vehicle but a node in a vast communication web. To the Germans, the battlefield was a chessboard. To the Americans, it was a radio network where information moved faster than bullets. By the summer of 1944, the contrast between the two systems, AM versus FM, scarcity versus ubiquity, was no longer subtle. It was decisive. The Americans had created the world's first battlefield communication network. The Germans were still fighting with radios designed a decade earlier, built too few in number, and installed in too few tanks. The gap was no longer just technical. It was existential. July 25, 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy, once the Germans' greatest ally, now shook under the weight of American firepower. Operation Cobra had begun, a massive aerial bombardment followed by the breakout of American armored forces. On paper, the German Panzer divisions defending the sector should have been formidable. They had Panthers with guns and armor superior to the Shermans. They had veteran crews, many hardened by years of fighting on the Eastern Front. But when the ground shook and the skies filled with bombers, another battle unfolded, one not fought with steel or explosives but with radio waves. The Americans were no longer fighting in isolated groups. By this stage, every Sherman, every tank destroyer, every command vehicle carried an SER 508 radio. Each was a transmitter, not just a listener. That single fact changed everything. When the dust of the bombing lifted and the order came to advance, American tank formations moved not as scattered platoons, but as one organism. One tank would spot a gap and report it. Others miles away adjusted instantly. A German ambush would spring, only to be met with artillery called in within minutes, guided by tank commanders relaying coordinates with clarity unheard of in German systems. For the Germans, the experience was shattering. They had grown used to fighting Soviet armor, where communication was often primitive, sometimes limited to flags waved from turrets. But against the Americans, they now faced an enemy who could concentrate force with frightening speed. A tank unit pinned down by fire did not die alone. Within moments, reinforcements would arrive, guided not by guesswork but by direct radio calls. The battlefield, instead of being a place of isolation, became a conversation. Consider the experience of the Panzer Lehr Division, once Germany's pride. By July, it was a shadow of its former self, but still fielded veteran crews. These men expected to fight Shermans one-on-one, confident in their thicker armor and superior guns. Instead, they faced a swarm that always seemed to know where to strike. Panther tanks found themselves encircled not because of American speed alone, but because U.S. radios allowed for coordination across broken terrain. Each Sherman was a node in a vast web. Each crew was connected to artillery, infantry, and neighboring tanks. The result was relentless pressure, applied not randomly but with precision. German radios could not match this. The Fug 5 sets, even in their best conditions, offered a fraction of the reliability. Worse, most German tanks didn't even carry them. A typical platoon might have one or two transmitters. When those were destroyed, and they were often targeted first, the remaining vehicles were reduced to silence. Orders came late if at all. Coordination collapsed. To the American crews it seemed almost unfair. To the Germans, it felt like fighting with their ears plugged, stumbling in the dark while their enemy moved with eyes wide open. The telephone boxes welded onto Sherman hulls now brought infantry fully into this network. In the bocage this was life or death. Infantrymen, crouching along hedgerows, could warn tanks of hidden threats or request immediate fire support. Instead of tanks blundering forward and being destroyed by Panzerfausts, the Americans began to advance as combined arms teams, united not by theory but by literal wires and radio waves. This adaptation was so effective that German soldiers captured in Normandy often commented on it with disbelief. To them, tank infantry cooperation at that level was unthinkable. As Operation Cobra unfolded, American armored forces poured through the gap with a fluidity that stunned both allies and enemies. General Patton's Third Army, once unleashed, became a force of motion. Shermans drove hundreds of miles in weeks, an operational tempo that German planners considered impossible. And again it was radios that made it real. Orders did not take hours to arrive. They traveled in minutes, sometimes seconds. A division commander could redirect entire armored columns on the fly, confident that his orders would cascade instantly through battalion, company, and platoon nets. German commanders, by contrast, relied heavily on landlines, already shredded by Allied air attacks, or on messengers who risked death at every turn. Their tanks, even when powerful individually, became isolated clusters, unable to mass at the right place and time. This inability to communicate effectively made German armor less than the sum of its parts. American armor, by contrast, became far more than the sum of its parts. The numbers told the story. In Cobra, U.S. armored divisions like the 2nd and 3rd coordinated hundreds of tanks simultaneously. Artillery fire missions were executed in as little as 3 minutes from the moment a target was identified. German units required 3 times as long if they could coordinate at all. The result was not just tactical victories, but systemic collapse. When an American armored thrust broke through, the Germans could not regroup effectively. Their attempts to counterattack dissolved into piecemeal engagements, fed into the American grinder one platoon at a time. Witnesses on both sides commented on the psychological effect. For American crews, radios provided a lifeline of reassurance. Even when surrounded by hedgerows and smoke, they could hear familiar voices, instructions, and warnings. For German crews, silence bred fear. The moment a command tank was lost, the rest felt abandoned, left to fight as individuals rather than as a coordinated unit. That isolation gnawed at morale, turning disciplined soldiers into survivors more concerned with their own immediate survival than with the greater mission. By the end of July, the German front in Normandy had cracked. Operation Cobra was not just a breakout, it was the beginning of a rout. And while bombs and bullets tore the holes in the German line, it was the invisible threads of communication that allowed American armor to exploit them. The SCR 508 radios, born in laboratories and factories far from the battlefield, now dictated the pace of war in France. For the Germans it was another lesson learned too late. Reports trickled back to high command describing American coordination as exceptional and methodical. Yet they still failed to grasp that it was not merely training, it was technology. They believed that if they trained their crews harder, imposed stricter discipline, they might match the Americans. But no amount of discipline could change the physics of amplitude modulation. No amount of training could conjure radios that did not exist. And so, with every passing week, the German advantage in tank quality mattered less. Their vaunted Panthers and Tigers, impressive as individual machines, could not offset the fact that they were fighting alone. The Shermans, often maligned for their thinner armor and smaller guns, were never truly alone. They were linked, to each other, to artillery, to infantry, to command. They were parts of a greater whole, a network that no German tank could equal. The German soldier saw this every day. He saw American tanks appear in places they shouldn't have been, respond to threats faster than expected, and coordinate strikes with uncanny timing. To him, it felt like the Americans had broken the rules of war. In truth, the rules had changed. The side with better communication would decide the battle. And in Normandy, that side was America. September 1944. The Lorraine countryside stretched out in misty fields, its rolling hills and patches of woodland concealing dangers at every turn. The Battle of Ericourt would soon become one of the most striking demonstrations of how communication could outweigh raw firepower. Here, American tank crews and their Shermans, lighter, less armored, and less heavily armed than their German adversaries, would face waves of Panthers from newly formed Panzer brigades. The Germans had the technical advantage. The Americans, however, carried something invisible yet decisive: radios in every tank. When the first German attacks came, they were deliberate and forceful. Panthers rolled forward, their 75mm high-velocity guns capable of piercing a Sherman frontally at ranges the Americans could barely reply to. In a duel of single tanks, the outcome seemed obvious. Yet Ericourt was not a battle of isolated duels. It was a battle of networks against individuals. As morning fog clung to the fields, American scouts spotted movement. Within moments, reports flowed across the airwaves: direction, numbers, bearing. Tank destroyer units received coordinates before they even saw the enemy with their own eyes. Shermans shifted into ambush positions, guided by voices over the radio. Artillery observers embedded with the armor relayed information upward, bringing down bombardments on German columns still maneuvering into place. For the Germans, communication was slower, fragmented, and often silent. Their new Panzer brigades were poorly trained, rushed into combat with little cohesion. Many of their tanks carried only receivers, unable to warn others of threats or coordinate complex maneuvers. When fog cleared and American fire erupted, the Germans were caught piecemeal. Panthers, though formidable, entered kill zones without support, each one unaware that its neighbor was already destroyed just over the hill. American reports from Ericourt describe scenes where Shermans and tank destroyers coordinated seamlessly across miles. A Panther would appear only to be engaged not by one Sherman but by several, attacking from different angles. It wasn't luck, it was coordination built on constant radio chatter. Enemy moving northeast, 2 Panthers half a mile out, one crew might call. Instantly, others adjusted positions. Within minutes, artillery shells were walking across the German path, forcing them into cover. By the time they recovered, ambushing Shermans struck from the flanks. German commanders were bewildered. How could American units, scattered across fields and villages, react so quickly to changing situations? Their own orders took time to trickle down, often arriving after conditions had changed. The Americans, by contrast, adapted in real time. The SCR 508 radios, crystal-controlled and resistant to interference, carried voices clearly across the chaos of battle. A German officer later remarked that it seemed as if the Americans saw with many eyes and struck with many hands. In truth, they were simply hearing with many ears and speaking with many voices. The statistics from Ericourt are telling. Over the course of 3 weeks, the U.S. 4th Armored Division destroyed 281 German armored vehicles while losing only 41 Shermans. A kill ratio of nearly 7-1. On paper, such an outcome seemed impossible. The Panther outclassed the Sherman in every technical metric: gun, armor, range. Yet technology on paper does not win battles. In practice, it was the ability to coordinate, to share information instantly, that turned the tide. Consider the contrast in German doctrine. Their tanks were designed to operate under centralized control, with commanders issuing detailed orders to platoons that executed them rigidly. This system depended on radios, but Germany never built enough of them. Their industry, strained by strategic bombing and material shortages, simply could not supply every tank with a transmitter. By 1944, most Panthers went to the field with only basic receiver sets. They could hear their commander but could not speak back. In the fog of Erricourt, that silence was fatal. American crews, meanwhile, displayed a different psychology. They fought with confidence, knowing they were part of a living web of support. If they spotted a threat, they could call for help. If they were in trouble, reinforcements could be guided to them. Even if their tank was knocked out, they knew others would adjust instantly, their voices carrying over the net to keep the battle flowing. This sense of connection, invisible but real, lifted morale in ways statistics cannot measure. The Germans learned a bitter lesson. Their superior machines fought as individuals. The Americans' supposedly inferior Shermans fought as teams. And in modern war, the team, coordinated, adaptable, connected, overpowers the lone warrior no matter how strong. The victory at Erricourt rippled beyond the battlefield. It proved, beyond doubt, that American armored doctrine was not just functional, it was dominant. Radio networks allowed flexible command structures known as combat commands to function at full potential. A division could break into smaller, tailored task forces, each assembled for a specific mission, confident that communication would hold them together. This flexibility baffled German commanders, who clung to rigid structures dictated by their limited communication capabilities. Erricourt also highlighted the growing intelligence gap. German officers who analyzed the battle attributed their defeat to inexperience and fog. They noted American coordination but failed, once again, to connect it to radio technology. They believed that with more training and discipline, their Panthers would prevail. They did not realize that no amount of discipline could overcome the limitations of amplitude modulation or the lack of transmitters. It was a blind spot that cost them dearly, not just at Erricourt but throughout the final year of the war. For the American crews who fought there, the memory was one of unity. They remembered voices over the radio guiding them, encouraging them, warning them. They remembered calling for artillery and hearing the reassuring reply, "Fire mission inbound." They remembered infantry using tank telephones, shouting directions that meant the difference between life and death. And they remembered the fog lifting not to reveal chaos, but a coordinated battlefield where each part of the machine worked with the others. The Battle of Erricourt stands as a testament to an invisible revolution. Not the clash of armor, not the thunder of guns, but the quiet clarity of a human voice carried over electromagnetic waves. Those voices, amplified by American industry and ingenuity, shaped the outcome as surely as any shell fired. In the end, the Panthers lay smoking in the fields of Lorraine, their superior guns silent, their thick armor cracked. The Shermans, many scarred and battered, rolled on. Their secret was not invincibility but connection. And connection, as Erricourt proved, was stronger than steel. March 1945. The Rhine River, broad, swift, and historic, stood as the last great natural barrier before the heart of Germany. 4 months, German commanders had planned to make its crossing impossible. Bridges were wired with explosives, artillery emplacements lined the far bank, and reserves were held back to strike any attempted crossing. The German High Command believed that even if their army was battered, the Rhine could buy time. But they did not reckon with what radios would make possible for the Allies. On March 7, an American armored spearhead from the 9th Armored Division approached the small town of Remagen. There, to their astonishment, they found the Ludendorff Bridge still standing. Explosives had been detonated, but the structure remained intact. For the Americans, this was the kind of opportunity commanders dream of, and one that could vanish in minutes. In previous wars, it might have taken hours for news of the discovery to climb the chain of command. By the time orders returned, the chance would be gone. At Remagen, radios changed everything. Within minutes, reports flew across the ether. Tank commanders shouted into throat microphones, infantry relayed confirmations, and battalion nets linked upward to division headquarters. Higher command was informed almost instantly. The bridge was standing. Decisions that might once have taken hours now took minutes. Reinforcements were ordered forward, engineers rushed in, and artillery observers began directing covering fire, all coordinated by radio. For the Germans, the scene was chaos. Their telephone lines had long since been cut by air attacks. Runners carried messages through shellfire, often too late. Local commanders begged for reinforcements, but confusion reigned. Units that might have counterattacked arrived piecemeal, each moving without knowledge of the others. Some formations never received clear orders at all. Radios in German tanks sputtered with static, their range collapsing under the strain of movement and battlefield noise. The bridge that was supposed to stop the Americans instead became a funnel through which they poured, unstoppable in their coordination. American tankers recalled the scene with awe. Orders went out, and it felt like the whole army shifted at once, one veteran later wrote. That impression wasn't far from the truth. Radio nets carried instructions across divisions, synchronizing movements that spanned miles. Tank platoons from different battalions, even different divisions, suddenly operated as if they had trained together. They covered one another, secured bridgeheads, and expanded the lodgment before German forces could mount a coherent response. Contrast this with the German experience. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, received fragmented reports. Units reported enemy crossings but without detail. He struggled to piece together the situation, issuing orders that were outdated before they reached the front. In his final transmissions before his network collapsed entirely, he lamented, "No contact with adjacent units. No communication with higher headquarters. Fighting continues, but coordination impossible." Those words captured the collapse of the German war effort, not in armor or manpower but in communication. The capture of the Remagen Bridge was more than a tactical victory. It was a demonstration of operational tempo, a concept only possible with modern communications. American forces could react faster than the Germans could even understand the situation. Radios provided not just coordination but speed of awareness, speed of decision, speed of action. And speed, in March 1945, was the difference between a contained bridgehead and the sudden unraveling of the German defense of the Rhine. In the days that followed, American armored divisions poured across hastily constructed pontoon bridges, each movement choreographed by radio. Artillery shifted fire instantly as new targets were reported. Fighter bombers dove on German positions guided by forward air controllers in radio-equipped vehicles. Shermans coordinated with infantry, engineers, and artillery as if they were different limbs of the same body. What had begun as a desperate gamble became a decisive breakthrough, powered by the invisible threads of communication. The Germans, for their part, recognized the disaster too late. They had relied on fixed telephone networks that were vulnerable to air power, and on radios that lagged behind by nearly a decade of technology. They had placed their faith in armor and firepower, but armor and firepower without communication meant isolated pockets of resistance, destroyed one after another. By the time they tried to adapt, their industrial base was collapsing under bombing and shortages. Radios that should have been standard in every tank remained scarce. The irony was painful. German doctrine in the 1930s had pioneered the use of radios in armored warfare. Heinz Guderian himself had insisted on it, making blitzkrieg possible. Yet by 1945, it was the Americans who had carried his vision to its fullest extent, not with superior tanks but with superior communications. Every Sherman was a command tank. Every platoon could act as its own coordinated force. And every division could move faster than the German high command could comprehend. The Rhine crossing symbolized this transformation. Where once rivers had been barriers that slowed armies for weeks, now they were obstacles to be reported, analyzed, and overcome in hours. Radios had compressed time. They had turned what should have been a pause in operations into an opportunity for momentum. And momentum, in the closing months of the war, was fatal to a Germany already on the verge of collapse. The lesson of Remagen echoed far beyond the banks of the Rhine. It showed that in modern warfare, the true decisive factor was not always the tank with the thickest armor or the gun with the longest barrel. It was the army that could move information faster than the enemy could react. It was the side that could coordinate across units, services, and even continents. At Remagen, the Sherman's 75mm gun was not the weapon that mattered most. It was the 181-pound SR 508 radio bolted inside, carrying voices across the chaos. And as the Americans crossed into Germany, they carried with them not just steel and fire but connection. A connection that bound their forces into a single entity. A connection that no German Panther, however powerful, could break. April 1945. The war in Europe was nearing its end, but the fighting remained brutal. In western Germany, Allied forces prepared to encircle what remained of the Wehrmacht in the industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley. Here, coal mines and steel mills had once fueled Hitler's war machine. Now, over 300,000 German troops were trapped in a pocket surrounded by American and British armies. The final collapse of German resistance in the Ruhr was not simply a matter of superior numbers. It was the culmination of years of communication dominance. For the Americans, the pocket became a vast exercise in coordination. Entire armies converged on the encirclement, adjusting their advances day by day, unit by unit. What made this possible was not just maps and orders, but a seamless web of radio communication that linked armor, infantry, artillery, and air power into a single crushing force. American armored columns moved like water around the edges of the Ruhr, sealing escape routes before German units could even react. Tank commanders reported German movements in real time. Artillery fire was redirected within minutes. Forward observers, riding in Shermans or jeeps fitted with radios, called down devastating airstrikes on concentrations of troops or vehicles. Infantry divisions advanced in coordination with armor, guided by radios that tied them into the same network. Inside the pocket, the German experience was the polar opposite. Telephone lines had been destroyed by bombing. Radio sets, where they existed at all, were limited in number and plagued by static. Commanders struggled to assemble a coherent picture of the battlefield. Units fought in isolation, often unaware that they were already cut off. By the time orders arrived, if they arrived, they were outdated. The Wehrmacht was not simply beaten, it was silenced. The encirclement ended with the surrender of more than 300,000 German troops. For American soldiers, the most striking detail was not just the number of prisoners, but how disorganized they were. Entire battalions surrendered without firing a shot, not because they lacked weapons but because they lacked coordination. Cut off from higher command, they could not act as a unified force. Against an enemy bound together by radio, they were helpless. But this battlefield dominance did not come out of nowhere. It was the product of industrial decisions made years earlier, and of factories thousands of miles away. To understand why every Sherman tank carried a powerful radio, we must look back to America's industrial mobilization. In 1941, the U.S. Army standardized a family of radios, the SR 508, SR 528, and SR 538, for all medium tanks. The contract went to Galvin Manufacturing Company, soon to be known worldwide as Motorola. Before the war, Motorola built consumer radios for cars. Converting to military production required a transformation on a staggering scale. The SR 508 alone was an engineering marvel of its time. 181 pounds of carefully designed electronics, capable of delivering 25 watts of crystal-controlled FM power. Each set contained thousands of precision-made components, resistors, capacitors, oscillators, that had to function reliably inside the shaking, vibrating, overheating steel box of a Sherman tank. To produce tens of thousands of these radios, Motorola retooled entire assembly lines, trained thousands of new workers, and perfected mass production techniques that could meet military tolerances. Production numbers tell the story of American might. In 1942, only a few thousand sets were delivered. By 1943, the number had quadrupled. By 1944, over 24,000 sets rolled off the lines. In total, more than 50,000 were produced, enough to equip every single one of the 49,000 Sherman tanks built during the war, with extras to spare for command vehicles and replacements. This 100% deployment rate was unique among all belligerents. Germany, by contrast, never solved its production bottleneck. In 1943, they built roughly 5,700 medium tanks, but fewer than 2,000 FUG-5 transceivers. Many of those radios went to command tanks, leaving ordinary panzers with nothing more than receivers, or nothing at all. By 1944, the situation worsened as Allied bombing crippled German industry. Radio factories that might have closed the gap were destroyed. Even when radios were available, they relied on outdated AM technology, drifting off frequency and filling with static at the worst possible moments. The difference was stark. In American units, every tank was a potential command tank. In German units, losing a single command vehicle could paralyze an entire platoon. This structural weakness turned battles into routes once command tanks were knocked out. What made the American radio so much better? The answer lay in frequency modulation, or FM. Edwin Armstrong's invention, adopted by the U.S. Army, eliminated the interference that crippled AM systems. While German tank crews struggled to hear voices buried under engine noise and static, American crews heard crystal-clear orders. The SCR 508's 10 preset channels, locked in place by crystal oscillators, allowed tankers to switch frequencies quickly without losing alignment. Dual receivers let commanders monitor both their platoon and company nets simultaneously. Even the supporting technology mattered. Noise-canceling throat microphones, intercom systems that allowed every crewman to speak, and power supplies that filtered out electrical interference. All these details combined to create radios that worked under battlefield conditions. The result was reliability. American crews trusted their radios the way they trusted their guns. German crews, in contrast, never knew if their radios would even function when it mattered most. By the time of the Ruhr Pocket, this communications advantage had reshaped doctrine itself. American armored forces no longer relied on rigid structures. They created flexible combat commands, ad hoc task forces of tanks, infantry, artillery, and engineers tailored for specific missions. The only reason this worked was because every element could communicate. Radios turned combined arms from a theory into a reality. German forces, stuck with inadequate radios, remained tied to rigid organizations. Their command philosophy assumed limited communication, and so they built structures that collapsed once disrupted. At the Ruhr, the difference was decisive. American units maneuvered fluidly, improvising new combinations on the fly. German units, unable to adapt, disintegrated. One American officer summed it up after the war: "Our tanks weren't better. Our guns weren't bigger. But we could talk to each other and they couldn't. That made all the difference." The industrial base that produced these radios was as much a weapon as any tank or gun. In Chicago, Motorola employed thousands of workers, many of them women, assembling radios with the same urgency as those who built aircraft in California or ships in Virginia. Each finished set represented not just technology, but an investment in the idea that communication was as essential as firepower. Germany never achieved that synthesis. They built magnificent tanks with thick armor and powerful guns, but too often those machines rolled into battle deaf and mute. The Ruhr Pocket was their final testament: powerful weapons scattered across the landscape, but unable to fight as a whole. Against them stood an American force whose radios bounded into a single organism. The outcome was inevitable. By April 1945, as the Ruhr collapsed and the Third Reich staggered toward defeat, one truth had become undeniable. The war had been decided not just by who built the best tanks, but by who connected them best. The Sherman's 75mm gun could destroy a Panzer, but its SCR 508 radio could destroy a German formation. The guns finally fell silent in May of 1945. Germany lay in ruins, its armies surrendered, its generals broken. In the years that followed, Allied investigators pored over captured equipment, battle reports, and factories, trying to understand what had gone so wrong for the Wehrmacht. Time and again, one conclusion stood out: communications. American technical intelligence teams studied German radios and confirmed what combat experience had already proved. The Fug-5 and its siblings were competent for the 1930s, but by 1944 they were hopelessly obsolete. Limited range, poor frequency stability, crippling interference, all compounded by chronic shortages. A U.S. Army report bluntly stated, German tank communications lagged at least 5 years behind. The Soviets reached a similar verdict. Their own tank forces had suffered from communication poverty, relying on flags and hand signals well into 1943. But after receiving American FM sets through Lend-Lease, Red Army commanders recognized the value instantly. In the post-war years, when they rebuilt their armored doctrine, they looked not to German radios but to American models as the template for the future. For Germany, the failure cut deep. Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, had always insisted that radios were the backbone of armored warfare. Yet the Reich he served could not deliver. By late 1944, he admitted in a memorandum that American communication had erased German advantages in tank design. The Tiger and Panther might have been superior machines, but without reliable coordination they were blunt instruments. The irony was crushing. The nation that pioneered tank radios in the 1930s ended the war unable to equip even half its armored fleet. Meanwhile, the United States, a nation that had entered the war with modest armored forces, finished it with the most connected army in history. The lessons of that advantage extended far beyond World War II. In the decades that followed, every major military embraced the principle that communications were not an accessory but a weapon in themselves. When West Germany rebuilt its army in the 1950s, every Leopard tank rolled off the production line with comprehensive radio systems, reflecting the hard lesson that connection meant survival. In American doctrine, the idea of flexible combat commands evolved into the modern concept of combined arms task forces, where radios, and later digital networks, bound every element together. The principle proved itself again in the Cold War and beyond. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, American and coalition forces faced Iraqi units equipped with Soviet-designed tanks, many of them technically superior to the M1 Abrams in sheer armor thickness. Yet the outcome was never in doubt. Coalition forces fought as a connected network. Iraqi forces, isolated and poorly coordinated, were dismantled in days. The same story repeated in 2003, when network-centric warfare allowed U.S. units to advance with breathtaking speed. The roots of those victories lay in the dusty fields of North Africa in 1942, when Sherman tanks first rolled into battle with SIR 508 radios humming inside. For the men who served in those Shermans, the radios meant more than strategy. They meant reassurance. A tanker could face the terror of enemy fire with the knowledge that he was not alone. Even if cut off by smoke or terrain, he remained part of something larger, able to call for help, to share warnings, to coordinate with unseen comrades. That invisible bond was often the difference between life and death. German crews, by contrast, wrote of isolation. Otto Carius, one of the most skilled Tiger commanders, described how limited communications forced tankers to fight individual battles, unable to share what they saw or felt. For all the might of German armor, the silence inside their machines was a kind of prison. In hindsight, the story carries a simple but profound lesson. Wars are not won by the strongest individual weapons, but by the connections between them. A tank is not just steel and firepower, it is part of a network, and the strength of that network decides the outcome. The Americans understood this earlier than their enemies. They built not just tanks but systems. They invested not only in armor and guns, but in the unseen threads that tied every unit together. Those threads, spun out of copper and radio waves, strangled the Wehrmacht as surely as any bullet or shell. And so, when we look back on the Sherman tank today, it is easy to focus on its flaws, its thinner armor, its less powerful gun compared to the Panther or Tiger. Yet those comparisons miss the larger truth. The Sherman was never meant to fight alone. It was meant to fight as part of a team, a web of steel and voices that extended across the battlefield. The real weapon was not the 75mm gun, but the 181-pound box of electronics tucked behind its armor. That box turned every Sherman into a node in the world's first armored battlefield network. Together, those nodes created a collective intelligence that no isolated German tank could hope to match. By the war's end, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel is said to have admitted, "We knew how to build better tanks, but you knew how to make them work together." Whether the quote is apocryphal or not, it captures the essence of the war. The Germans built machines. The Americans built systems. And in warfare, it is the system that wins. Today, the legacy of the Sherman's radios lives on in every modern armored unit. From NATO battalions in Europe to U.S. divisions deployed overseas, the idea that every vehicle must be connected is unquestioned. Digital systems have replaced analog tubes, satellites have replaced antennas, but the principle is the same: connection equals survival. The battlefield of the future will not be won by the heaviest tank or the biggest gun. It will be won by the side that sees more, shares more, and coordinates faster. That lesson was first written in North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany, in the static and silence of German radios, and in the clear voices echoing through American headsets. So the next time you see an old Sherman tank sitting quietly in a museum, look closer. Beyond the armor and the tracks, beyond the gun barrel, lies the secret of its true power. The radios inside that tank, simple, heavy, and overlooked, changed the course of history. Because in the end, the real story of the Sherman is not just about steel and fire. It is about connection. And if this story has given you a new perspective on the war, remember, history is full of these hidden truths. Machines that looked ordinary but carried extraordinary power. Technologies that seemed invisible but decided the fate of nations. If you'd like to discover more forgotten stories of World War II, make sure to subscribe to this channel. Tap the bell icon so you don't miss the next deep dive into the war's hidden battles. And if this episode taught you something new, give it a like. It helps bring more history lovers into our community. Because history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how yesterday's choices shaped today's world, and how the lessons of connection, communication, and cooperation still matter in our lives right now.